Alrighty, folks. Well, let's get into the opening lab. So this is a show I do once a month for our Patreon subscribers. I give them a chance to send in opening questions, and then I do a bit of research and come prepared with my answers. And this month we have actually just 3 questions, but pretty good ones, I think. So yeah, let's get into it. First question comes from David Stewart, who says, "Hey Kostya, I'm preparing for a tournament coming up in a month. I play 1d5 to 1d4. This is a question from Black's point of view. But I'm not fully comfortable with my preparation against the dreaded London." I know, David. I know to play an early c5, but I'm not entirely sure where to go from d4, d5, bishop f4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, e3, or equivalent transposition. So let's put that on the board. Bishop f4, c5. Okay, move order. Yeah, it doesn't really matter here, but basically this position. Let's say knight c6, knight f3, knight f6, and so on. Should I consider playing it similar to my usual Catalan, but with the black pieces? Okay, so yeah, I haven't really covered the London too much on this channel. And I mean, there are many different things you can do. I would discourage folks from trying to learn a line. Like David was saying, he knows like to play c5 here, but it's not like c5 is the only good move in the position. This is just one of several ways to play. So I would discourage folks from thinking that against certain openings, like you can only play this move or you have to like know this move. Usually there's going to be lots and lots of options. So as long as you're just developing your pieces normally, you're pretty much going to get out of the opening alive, especially against an opening like the London system. Of course, people hate playing against it, but the nice thing is you can actually do many different things, and you're usually going to be totally okay because it's not the most aggressive system from the opening. So yeah, I mean, these lines with c5 I think are totally reasonable. But again, this is just kind of one way to play the position, and typically both knights come out, and then black looks to play quick queen b6 here and put some pressure on b2, and this is kind of a logical approach because white developed the bishop very early and black is kind of exploiting that. So this is definitely something that's very playable, and if you want, David, there was a good video by Danya on his YouTube channel, Grandmaster Daniel Nerditsky. I think it's called just like how to beat the London system or something, and he goes into detail in quite a bit on like these queen b6 lines. I think that would be a good video to watch if you want to kind of learn a little bit more about this setup. I think an even simpler setup that I would recommend, where you really don't have to know any theories, just about kind of understanding the setup, is to play, let's say, a typical Queen's Gambit decline setup, like with e6. White will play knight f3 here or c3. It doesn't make a huge difference. And then the bishop goes to d6. Now, generally, white's not just going to trade off this bishop. If they do, black can take with anything. So you can take with the queen if you want. And then you want to play for c5 and then possibly b6 and bringing this bishop out to a6, which we'll see is kind of a very key idea in this type of structure. Because this is black's one main problem here is this bishop on c8 is kind of passive, and so if you can solve the problem with this bishop either by developing it out to a6 or by getting in an e5 break with like knight d7 and e5 for example, and then the bishop can come out on its main diagonal, then black is totally fine as long as you achieve one of these plans. And c takes d6 I think is also very reasonable here, and yeah, again, as long as you find the job for your bishop, you're totally fine here as black. So most players here are going to go bishop g3. This is the usual idea of the London, to park the bishop. And then if we take, then white gets to play hg and open up the h-file. And we don't really want that. So I would advise you to hold off on taking until, let's say, white castles kingside. And then once the rook is off of the h-file, then you can take whenever. And if anything, that might even be kind of a nice weakness to impose. But for the moment, I would say just castle. And here white is again usually just developing knight d2, sometimes bishop d3, sometimes c3, sometimes bishop e2. There's different setups here white can try. But the plan for black that I think is very simple, again, is to just go b6, bring the bishop out to a6, make sure you're castled so that on c3, bishop a6, there's no queen a4 check that would win a piece. You know, takes, queen a4 check, and then knight is lost. So make sure you're castled before doing this. Trade off the light squared bishops, and yeah, I think black is pretty much fine here. Now, of course, your knight on a6 is going to be a little bit offsides, but the nice thing is that this is a very closed position. There's not really a whole lot going on in the center, which means you have time to simply bring the knight back to b8 and d7 and just put it on a normal square. You can also play c5 somewhere, make sure not to blunder your bishop, queen e7, queen c7, bring the knight out, play for e5, and yeah, I think black is absolutely fine. There's really not a whole lot you need to know. It's more about just playing the position, playing the structure. If white puts a knight on e5, generally it's a good idea to try to challenge this knight and trying to play some kind of knight d7, for example, and f6, or maybe just taking and then bringing the knight back to d7. Here maybe I would start with knight b8 just to cover this square first, and then I would strongly consider knight d7 and then fighting for this e5 square. But after trading off the light square bishops, there's really not a whole lot of danger, I think, to get mated here for black. So in general, this is going to be a pretty safe position. So that's the recommendation. Bishop d6, castles, b6, bishop a6. I think it's pretty simple, and you'll be absolutely fine. And then you'll have to play kind of an equalish middle game, you know, try to outplay the opponent, and so on. I'm a bit fortunate being a King's Indian player myself. I don't really have to deal with these kind of dry sidelines. When you play the King's Indian, you kind of get this added benefit that against all of these systems, you can definitely come up with a much more, or you can find a much more dynamic structure to play where you're not giving up this e5 square and then, you know, playing to open up the position and playing for the dynamics with the bishop on g7. But yeah, unfortunately, we can't have everything. If you want to play something solid against d4, then you got to play something solid against the London system as well. Yeah, there was a question in the chat about pushing c5. I mentioned this one earlier. I think c5 is a very reasonable way to play the position. Personally, I kind of like keeping the pawn back on c7 until later. I feel like it's not necessary to make this move right away, although it is a very, very popular one, but it's by no means like the only way to play the position for black. And so I think it makes sense just to get on with the development, castles, b6. The other nice thing about leaving the pawn on c7, actually, it's a good thing the question was asked, so I can mention this point, it also gives black flexibility to just play knight bd7, and then the bishop on d6 is not hanging, and then you can just, like, another very, very solid setup, let's say, is to go castles, knight d2, and knight d7, and then b6, bishop b7, queen e7, and you can play for knight e4, you can play c5, and it's a very typical QGD where I think all of black's pieces are participating. Bishop on b7 is a little bit passive, but it's supporting this nice knight on e4 and yeah, helping black fight for some space. So I think everything here is more or less playable. At what point do I need to know the names of openings? I don't know. There's some GMs that really don't know a lot of opening names. You know, they're like, this is an E6 Sicilian. That's how I think of it. This is a Sicilian with E6. They don't think like, is this Taimanov, Khan, Paulson? They're like E6. So I don't know if it's super necessary to know everything. Yeah, so question from HZO5. It's so hard remembering all the different lines. I don't know what exactly to do against so many. So yeah, that's the thing. That's why like pretty much every time this topic comes up, I really try to preach that you don't have to try to memorize anything. So if you're sitting there and you're like, okay, e4, I have to go here, they go here, I have to go here, you don't really need to do any of that. Like the point is to just play, like you know your setup, right? You play the position, try to make good moves in the opening. After the game, review, see where maybe you made a mistake, see where maybe you can improve. Because there's just like a million moves. You're never going to remember everything. So I think people have this misconception that, like, oh, if I could just remember all the moves in the opening, then I'll be a stronger player. But there's too much to remember. You're still going to be out of book by move 6, move 4, move 8. And then you're going to have like a whole, middle game, end game to play. And the worst thing is when people memorize moves and then they get to a position that they don't understand, which I've done many times. So speaking from experience here, you prep some line, you remember 12 moves of theory, and then you get to that position and you have no idea what to do. You know that the computer eval is kind of nice, but you don't know what to do from there. That's just like total recipe for disaster. Number one, it's unlikely that your opening prep is even going to work out. And then number two, even if it does, it's kind of useless if you're not competent at playing the resulting position. So yeah, Save-A-Lot saying I think it's better to memorize structures than actual openings. Well, yeah, I mean, I don't really consider it memorizing a structure. I feel like it's more about understanding a structure, right? Because it's like you have different plans and there's like different ideas. I guess you could boil it down to just like memorizing a bunch of like different little patterns. But I think it's, yeah, a little bit deeper than that. It's not the same thing as like, when you're memorizing like opening moves without really knowing what to do. It's more about, because during the game, you don't actually know what the right thing is. You still have to analyze the position, consider the thematic ideas for both sides, find the right plan. And of course, you have to pay attention to the concrete specifics in the actual position. Like you can be doing everything according to the book, but if you blunder a tactic, you're gonna lose the game. Like that's how it works. Sometimes like the most natural move in the position, developing multi-purpose move ends up being a blunder because there's just some tactic. Yeah. So yeah, general feeling on the opening is like try to find openings that you kind of like the style of. So if you're an attacking player, maybe you want to play like Open Sicilian or King's Indian. If you're just kind of strategic player, maybe like English opening, Caro-Kann. Just find an opening that you kind of like. Maybe you have a favorite player and you want to emulate the openings that they play, which I think is a very typical thing to do. And then play those openings and try to get some experience. And then the more you play them, the more you'll kind of understand the structure. Because yeah, it's not enough to just kind of know all of the thematic ideas. Like in the King's Indian, there's lots of little thematic ideas. Playing f5, f4, playing knight h5, playing knight g4, playing b5, like Benko style pawn break, playing e6, like Benoni ideas, h5, h4, like many, many different ideas. But of course, like figuring out what to do in the actual position requires like some analysis and so on. So that's why like the experience and like the understanding of the position is the most important thing. I mean it's no surprise, right? If you take two players and one of them is like clearly stronger than the other, let's say 200 points higher rated, then at some point it almost doesn't matter what the opening is, right? Like the stronger player is generally just going to outplay the opponent. Even if they don't know anything about the opening, they're probably going to have a better sense of just like the middle game and can outplay them from there. Anyway, okay. I hope that helps. We have more lectures on our YouTube channel. If you just search openings, I'm sure a lot of this stuff has come up before. But let's get to the next question. Which comes from Dean G. And Dean is asking, in the King's Indian, what happens after... Let me put it on the board. d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, f3 castles, bishop e3. Okay, why is e5 an inaccuracy? If we push c5, why is dc, dc, queen takes, rook takes, bishop takes c5 okay for black, even though we seem to be a clean pawn down? In general, I don't have a good basic setup against the Samisch variation yet. Yeah, Dean, absolutely. Thanks for the question. Okay, so yeah, here black has lots and lots of options. The Samisch is, of course, this setup starting with f3, where white often puts the bishop on e3, sometimes it goes to g5, but the general point is to defend the e4 pawn and to cover the g4 square so that black can't hit white with any annoying knight g4s. And typically what people do with this one is they often play it almost like an English or Yugoslav attack, which completely different opening here. We have like King's Indian versus Sicilian, but the setup is actually kind of similar. And then white often tries to castle queenside and then goes g4, h4, h5, and it's yeah, very aggressive way of playing. So here black has multiple ways to play here. I mean, the main move that black often starts with is castling, which for black, I think there's no reason in this position actually to delay it. You know, the king needs to get out of the center because what black wants to do eventually is open the center with either something like c5 or possibly e5. So yeah, bishop e3, again, white has other moves, but this is typically the most common. And this is where black really has a big choice, again, between c5, e5, and actually other moves as well. So e5 has kind of fallen out of fashion. I wouldn't say it's inaccurate. I would just say it's kind of risky, especially strategically risky. The problem with this one is that after white goes d5, the center obviously is now closed, and then when white goes queen d2 and castles queenside, well, this bishop on g7 doesn't really feel like it has a lot of scope in the position. And so as white, I used to play these f3 lines quite a bit, and I always enjoyed playing this structure with e5 and d5 because I felt like, okay, now my king is going to be safe on the queen side. Generally, the way black continues here is like knight h5 and f5, and trying to create play here. And yeah, basically, I never really liked this position from black's point of view. I felt like it was always risky. So for example, white castles here, and if black plays this usual f4, of course, white's king is not on the king side to get mated. And so, yeah, black can build up, but doesn't really achieve anything. And eventually, it's only black's king that's going to be opened up. Whereas in the meantime, white can actually just like tuck the king away on like a1 in this position, bring the rooks to c1 and b1 or d1. And because white has this massive space advantage, white can just like play for c5, and white still gets all of their usual like King's Indian pressure on the queen side. So again, strategically, super risky position for black because there's no clear target to attack, and it's very hard for black to open up the queen side in a way that doesn't just lose. Like a lot of times we think, okay, since white has castled queenside, if we can just open the queenside, then it should be good for black. But it's not so simple when like white has like a lot more firepower on this side of the board. If you open up the queenside, even though the king is somewhere here on a1, like white's pieces will still break through and crush. So black has to be very careful here. So generally players don't really push f4. Instead, they go something like knight d7. They try to keep the structure a little bit more flexible. But here, eventually, I think white can, yeah, just take right away and play like bishop d3 or knight e2. And white has a lot of very annoying ideas here, like rook g1 and g4, for example, or just playing knight to g3. Again, the bishop can come out to d3. And especially with this g4 break, which sometimes white even builds it up very slowly, like g3, rook g1, h3, g4. But once it comes, you know, the light squares open up, and yeah, black's king is in a lot of danger. So my personal feeling, I always like these positions from white's point of view, and I never felt comfortable. That said, lots of strong King's Indian players have played these positions and still will go into them. So I don't want to, I really don't agree that it's like inaccurate or anything. I think this line is fully playable. It's just not everyone's cup of tea. So that's why I kind of never really liked it myself for black. Now c5, on the other hand, I do think is a good move. Again, one of a couple options here. So this pawn sacrifice is kind of annoying. Objectively, black does get enough in this position after, let's say, knight to c6. And the idea here is that black is just getting a lot of long-term compensation. Because, of course, black has pressure over this entire diagonal. Black has much better development here. This rook is very quickly coming to c8. And from white's point of view, it's not really clear like where to put the pieces. Like, for example, the bishop can't be developed to d3 because it's hanging there. But if it goes to e2, then where does the knight go? Right? So you have to kind of develop the knight first and then figure out where the knight goes, then figure out where the bishop goes, and then maybe you can castle. But by the time white is doing that, black's pieces are already infiltrating. When white does castle, black gets like rook d2 in and goes after the second rank. Essentially, black just gets a ton of long-term compensation. I actually saw one kind of instructive game just recently that I'll share with you guys. Knight e2 was played, b6, bishop a3, bishop b7. And here black's idea is to play either for knight e5 and targeting everything, or sometimes knight a5, rook c8, and so on. So white goes knight d5, e6, knight e7 check. They trade, rook d7, white goes bishop a3, black goes rook a d8, knight c3, knight h5. So black is still a pawn down, but the initiative continues, and now there's threats of like either taking the knight or going rook d2 or going knight f4. White played g3, black played f5, and he actually won very quickly after bishop e2, knight f6, takes. White played king f2 here, which I think was a blunder, knight g4 check. And yeah, black was actually already winning here because takes, bishop d4 check, the king is forced back to the back rank, and then the rook on h1 is lost, and black is just winning the exchange and game over. I mean, white kind of blundered into it. I think this was a blitz game, so king f2, of course, wasn't necessary, but the position was absolutely fantastic for black. Like, he could have played rook d2 here, and tons and tons of compensation for the pawn. So long story short, it is a very, very healthy position for black, and theoretically, objectively, it stands very well. I don't often recommend it to students because it's kind of a tough position. I mean, you are a pawn down, and so it's like not really necessary. It's like, okay, for me, I wouldn't mind playing it because I feel like, okay, objectively it's a good position, and I understand where my compensation is, and I want to play like, principled opening. But yeah, if you're like, club player 15, 1600, and you're looking at this position, it's like an endgame, you're a pawn down, and it doesn't look fun for you, I totally sympathize. And so that's why I often actually don't recommend this one. But for the record, I think it's fully playable and definitely worth going into, but I can understand why you would have reservations. So one way to get around this is you can play b6 here with the idea of playing for c5. And in general, the idea behind c5 is to get white to advance forward with d5. And I've always liked this kind of structure more because, well, if white wants to castle queenside, then I want the bishop on g7 to be open. And here I would think it's very, very risky because we essentially now have a kind of Benoni structure where white is committed to playing f3. And yeah, in the Benoni, the bishop on g7 is, of course, very strong, and black is often creating very easy counterplay with a6 and b5, which makes it just pretty much impossible for white to castle queenside here and actually feel safe. It'd be like the greatest, Sicilian dragon of all time. So generally white switches gears and starts to develop the pieces and playing like knight e2, knight g3, bishop e2, castles kingside. And in the meantime, black plays e6 here. It's very important to make this exchange to try to open up some lines. Bishop a6 is a very typical idea as well once you play b6. And yeah, I think it's actually a absolutely fine position for black to play. The Benoni gets kind of a bad rap, but you have to keep in mind that, when people say the Benoni, what they mean is this position or this opening where white has a lot of different options in terms of how to develop their pieces. But once, both sides are committed to like f3 and then bishop e3 and b6, queen d2, and all this stuff, this is no longer just like a classic Benoni. This is just Benoni structure, and I would say it's actually a very good version of the Benoni for black, where white definitely has not, where white hasn't had a chance to play, the most dangerous setups, IMO. So, okay, this one is fully playable, and as a last suggestion, I would just say a6 here is a recent line that's been quite popular, with the idea to go knight d7 and sacrifice a pawn with b5. Um, Here, at least, you get to keep the queens on with this pawn sack, but it's a pretty fun line. It's been very, very popular at the GM level. So for example, white often goes either queen d2 here, or knight e2 is very common, and then black just goes b5 right away, or queen d2, black starts with knight d7, knight e2, and then black plays b5, and basically waiting for white to block the bishop, and then going b5 here. Although a lot of times you can even let white take with the bishop, it's not a huge deal. But the basic point is to play essentially a type of Benko gambit. Black goes c6, white brings the knight back, and then black plays e5, and then d5, and just blasts the center wide open while white's king is on e1. And yeah, to me, I think this is, again, fully healthy pawn sacrifice. Black gets enough compensation. And in general, if you're a King's Indian player, I think these are the kinds of positions, we should be happy to reach and play. Where, yeah, we've given up a pawn, but we have these open files in the long run, and yeah, it's going to take white several moves to complete their development, and in the meantime, we're playing d5 and just opening everything up, opening the files and diagonals, and just creating tons and tons of play. Yeah, if white goes something like d5 here, doesn't really fully keep things closed. I think black can just start taking, for example, and then going like bishop a6, let's say, and then eventually taking, and then knight b6 and d5, and or knight of 6, d5, and yeah, blasting everything open. Maybe taking first, actually, like this, and then bishop a6, and yeah, very, very scary for white. So, okay, bunch of options there. Again, c5, fully playable. I wouldn't really be afraid of that endgame, but I can understand why you wouldn't like it. b6 is kind of a more flexible way to play a c5 type of position, and then a6 is just pretty fun pawn sacrifice. All right, Dean, hope that makes sense. Yeah, Ken, these shows are very, very popular. So the 2.5 thousand viewers, that's not surprising. Lots of grandmaster seconds, they watch the show to try to pick up ideas, figure out current openings meta. It's, yeah, actually, yeah, 2.5K, it's it's a little low, if anything. Cool. Yeah, I'll say on the King's Indian lately, I've been looking at the Gawain Jones repertoire on Chessable, and I would say it's very good, but the main thing on the King's Indian is, everything, all that stuff I said earlier about like learning an opening is about understanding the structures and the typical middle game ideas, and only then, maybe it's helpful to learn a little bit of theory. The King's Indian is like that, like times 10. Like you can literally, again, just play it without knowing any theory whatsoever, but having studied a lot of classic games and seen a lot of themes, and you would be absolutely fine. Yeah, so I really believe it's only like, I would say, I mean, for me, I started learning or trying to learn openings at a serious level when I was around 2200. Before then, I was, again, playing like very, very little theory, just like very simple openings like e4, e5, d4, d5, and really not doing a whole lot. Then around 2200, then my coach told me, okay, probably time to start working on some serious openings. So yeah, for me, it's like theory was never a big part of it growing up. Nowadays, it's kind of different because there's a lot more access to it. But yeah, I do feel like it's something that is just like like the sprinkles on top, right? It's like you need to build a very solid base first of knowing how to play chess, how to play different middle game positions, isolated queen pawn against the isolated queen pawn, positions with opposite sides castling. You know how to play a lot of like classic endgames, knight versus bishop, two bishops advantage, and so on. And once you have like a really, really solid base, then that's when it's kind of useful to like study like move orders, like, this move here first is better than this move because da da da. Like, I feel like before you have this really fundamental base, a lot of that work is just going to be lost. And yeah, of course, there's a lot of players, yeah, at the lower levels that are basically just kind of, right, playing for tricks out of the opening. And that's a bit unfortunate, but for me, it's like, okay, if you lose one time to something tricky, just look it up, right? But don't spend like, 3-4 hours trying to trying to like memorize everything ahead of time. Yeah, there are, let's say, very few openings where like you have to know um like some very precise moves, or like you just lose the game. Like a lot of the tricky openings and gambits, it's like you don't even have to know that much. It's like if you just follow like normal chess principles, a lot of times you can get a very normal position or advantage or whatever. So I think it's kind of overblown. So yeah, unfortunately for me, like the Cotronius book was really not, I don't know, not that helpful for me personally. I got one of the volumes, I think volume 3 or 5, I don't remember. For me, I don't know, I think this book might be more useful for like correspondence players, but yeah, it was just like tons and tons of like lines and computer analysis, and I don't know, I didn't really get a sense of like how to play the position. It was just like, oh, in this line black has this idea, and in this line black has this idea, and it's just way too much. Um, with Gawain's repertoire, I feel like it's a lot more cohesive, where you don't really need to memorize everything um, to understand the position, right? So I think he does a good job, because I mean you can see it in how he plays. I think he wants to get positions where he just knows what the plan is. He even if it's like +1 +1.25 +1.5, he doesn't care. Like if it's a King's Indian, he understands his ideas. He's happy to play that against anyone, and that's, I think, kind of a good thing to strive for. Well, yeah, Ken Rush, even there against England Gambit, you don't even need to know that move, right? You can just give the pawn back, and then your position's absolutely fine. You don't you don't have to like go for this, whole thing. What I think about the Scotch, the Scotch is playable. I mean, all the main openings, I believe they're playable. It just depends, like if it leads to the type of positions that work for one or not. Like personally, as white, I never really felt like playing it, but for other players, it works quite well. For example, Nepo was playing the Scotch at a very high level for many years, and he had lots of success, but it's not super popular, at the top level otherwise. Okay, we have one more question, so let's get to it. And the last one comes from Kirk D, who is always asking good questions. And this time Kirk is asking e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. Okay, if I didn't know better, I would say that's Ruy Lopez. This is one opening maybe it's worth knowing the name of. Ruy Lopez. You can also call it Spanish game. A6, bishop a4, knight f6, knight c3. What is white's point with knight c3, and what is black's best approach to play against it? Yeah, so okay. Well, first things first, the basic idea behind knight c3 is to develop a piece and defend the e4 pawn. This move isn't the most popular here, but it does get played quite a bit by some very, very strong players. So it kind of leads to a different setup than a typical Ruy. So the classic Ruy that we're all kind of familiar with is white castles, or they can play d3, but essentially the structure is for white to play c3, bring this knight to d2, castle, maybe the knight goes to f1, e3, g3, and so on. That's kind of like the classic Ruy setup. Or white can start with castles and then play rook e1 and again go for this thing with c3, h3, d4, or d3 also, knight d2, and so on. So this has always been, let's say, the classic way to play, I think, because white, tries to build a full center, also tries to restrict the knight, and a very ambitious approach from a strategic sense. Developing the knight to c3, I think, I want to say it's quite interesting. Like, definitely some tricky ideas here, but the general point is that white wants to make something out of the d5 square, and that's why they're developing the knight to c3. So the knight is looking to jump to d5 at some point. Now the e4 pawn is defended, which means that white might be threatening to take and then take on e5. So what I would play here as black is I would just probably go b5 right away, bishop b3, and let's say bishop c5. And from black's point of view, I think it makes sense to develop this bishop here. Like, you could also play bishop e7, but I just think if you have the chance to develop this one more actively, then you should do so. And I feel like this position is a little bit healthier for black, or let's say a little bit more active, not necessarily healthier. You could go bishop e7, but then it kind of shows what white wants to achieve here. Let's say d3, d6. Now a3, typical move for white in this position to make sure that the bishop can back up to a2. If white does not play this move a3, then black often does want to play knight a5 and take the light square bishop. Of course, this is not possible before d6 is played because the e-pawn. But let's say a3, castles, castles. And yeah, basically it's kind of hard for black to really get a lot of counterplay in this position. So I think that's kind of what white is aiming for here. Like bishop g4, the bishop doesn't really want to be here after h3. With bishop b7, the bishop is going to feel very restricted here, and white's going to play knight to d5. And on bishop e6, which feels like the most solid move, white goes knight d5 anyway. And there have been some games here, like white goes knight d4, takes, white trades everything. And we get some position like this where, I don't know, to me it doesn't feel like black has a lot of upside. Like, it seems like we're solid, maybe slightly worse, but to me it feels like white has a little bit more space, kind of better bishop, and yeah, can just build up slowly. So this one doesn't appeal to me too much, so I would recommend, again, bishop c5 and just developing the bishop more actively. And the main thing to keep in mind is we're just trying to avoid a situation, let's say d3, d6, a3 again to stop knight a5. What we don't want to allow is something like castles, bishop g5. So this is the one danger for black, and one of the other points of knight d5 is, or knight c3 is, if they can get bishop g5 and knight d5, then this can be really, really scary. And for example, h6 and g5, number one, white can go back and our king is weak. Number two, maybe they can even sack here. Not sure about this exact position, but when this knight is threatening to go to d5, this is usually very, very dangerous, to say the least, especially when we're castled. But even bishop g3, and yeah, black's position is vulnerable. So the main thing to keep in mind when you develop your bishop to c5 is you need to make sure that this pin doesn't come. So before black is castled, if bishop g5 happens, then this is absolutely fine because we're not castled. We can just go g5 and the king can evacuate to the queen side. But before we castle, we have to make sure that we don't allow bishop to g5. So this is kind of the one thing I would suggest to keep in mind. And then black can just safely castle, and I think has no real issues. So castles, knight d5, bishop e6, for example. Now there is one kind of cute line that I think white might play for, that I would suggest from white's point of view, if someone wanted to try this line after bishop c5, would be this quick move knight d5. I was looking at this one because some players just start with this move right away. Now it's too early to take the e4 pawn here because there's going to be tactics and queen e2 and stuff. So I think black should just castle. And then after d3, h6. Very, very important move, again, stopping bishop g5. Now white goes c3. And here, most common move for black is to go d6, which makes total sense. But now white can take on f6. I was just looking at this line earlier. Queen takes f6, bishop d5, bishop d7, and this fantastic move, rook to g1. So this is kind of like a new idea. I hadn't seen this before looking at this line. Of course, reminds us of the very well-known game Aronian Kramnik from the Berlin candidates a couple of years ago, where as black, Kramnik played rook g8 in a similar position and mated him. But pretty much the same exact idea here, where white's just playing g4, g5, and it's actually very, very dangerous. Now, I think the theory continues here, like black tries h5, white goes h3, rook e8, g4, and yeah, it doesn't look like a fun position. So this is kind of an interesting trap from white's point of view. Black can avoid this one by playing this move, rook b8. Not an easy move to find. But the idea is that now this bishop doesn't come to d5 with tempo. So takes. Without bishop d5, there's going to be like knight a5 and stuff, and then black is getting counterplay, and then here on bishop d5 it's just knight e7. So white doesn't get this tempo, and then, yeah, never really has time to go rook g1 and g4 here, because black is just going to blow everything up with d5. So that's a hard move to find, but I just wanted to share that because it's kind of an interesting line. There's also different ways for black to play this one here. You can start with bishop c5, since taking is not advisable here for white, because the bishop takes f2, queen d4 check, and then white's king is going to be weak, and black is absolutely fine. You can also start with this one and then play b5, d6, h6, and so on. Or you can stick to the classics and play bishop e7. I think this is also totally okay. This, you can even follow up different ways, like for example d3, d6. You don't even have to play b5. I think this is more or less solid for black, and even bishop d7 or bishop e6. Or if castles and b5, bishop b3, d6, for example. And again, trying to play knight a5. So for example, d3, knight a5, and going after the bishop. So there are different move orders here. I think, again, it's more about understanding the ideas rather than trying to like memorize, okay, am I doing this or this? But if you understand the ideas of the different setups, you can choose bishop e7, bishop c5, knowing when to play h6, when not to play h6. This is what's kind of important for black in these lines. So to kind of sum up, because I feel like I definitely went off a little bit too long there. When white is playing knight c3, a lot of times it's kind of they're playing for some concrete activity, like either some bishop g5 or knight d5. So you have to be kind of careful. You have to watch out for your knight a5 ideas to take off this very strong bishop. And in general, you have to fight for this d5 square and also try to play for d5 in the long run if you can eventually seize control. In the meantime, we can develop the bishop either to e7 or c5. I think c5 is a little bit more active, e7 a little bit more solid. Then, of course, you don't really have to deal with any of these bishop g5 ideas because your bishop is on e7, but on the other hand, a little bit more passive. Okay, Kirk, hopefully that helps. Yeah, that's right. Does the rook to g1 make f2 vulnerable? I mean, I don't, not particularly so. Let me put that on the board. Um, yeah, I mean the f2 square was already it's already kind of vulnerable in general, but unfortunately for black, there's not really much to do with it. Like, you're not going to just give your bishop, right, just to bring the king out. So, um, yeah, it's kind of hard for black, right? You can't go bishop g4 because knight on c6 is hanging. So you kind of need a tempo to go like rook e8, but then white has time to go g4. And yeah, although it looks kind of weakening, there's unfortunately not much black can really do here to take advantage. Hey, Nico from Norway. Hello. Welcome to the channel, guys. I'm actually just finishing up the stream here. That's going to do it for this month's opening lab. That was the final question. Again, this is something I do once a month for some of our Patreon subscribers, where they send in opening questions, and then I do a little research and I come on here and answer them. And then sometimes I do some follow-up questions from the chat, but I can't stay for too long because I think I saw on the schedule that David was gonna come on. So I'll keep an eye on that. But before he's ready, I can take a couple more questions. What do I think is the best opening for beginners? Well, I don't believe in this concept of best. I think I think there's lots of good openings, and as long as you're playing something relatively mainstream, fighting for the center, developing your pieces, getting your king castled safely, I think that's totally fine. So London system, totally reasonable opening for beginners. You fight for the center, you develop your pieces, you castle. You can also play e4, knight f3, bishop c4, knight c3, castle. Again, developing your pieces. And then again, for black, same thing. Try to fight for the center, try to develop your pieces. I think you can make almost any of the main moves, e4, e5, e4, c5. Personally, I like the Sicilian. That would be my suggestion, or e4, e5. But again, there's lots of different openings. I would suggest also just trying different stuff out, because you might find something you like more. And the best opening is the one that you enjoy, right? The one that you really like playing, because you can play the opening in many different ways. If there was only one or two best openings, then everyone would be playing them, right? So that would be a very boring game. Yeah, like there's a good opening in if you guys know this game, tic-tac-toe. I don't know if you guys know this line, but you put the piece in. You should put if you go first, you should put the piece in the center, because then this is the best, because you have kind of access to everything, right? You can do a lot of wins with that. Now, if the opponent knows the right move here, then they can hold, they can defend. But if they don't, then you win. So it's kind of nice. It's like, you're playing for two results in tic-tac-toe. But the problem is everyone knows the best move, and so that's it. There's no game. They just put it in the corner, and then that's it. You can't do nothing. Can't do nothing. I don't know if you guys knew that. So if they put it in the center, you put it in the corner, and then you're good. So that's what it's like when there's a best opening. There's no game. There's no game whatsoever. I'm 4 years old and rated 800 in tic-tac-toe. How long before I can get to GM? I mean, I don't know. 4 years old, you're kind of running a little old there. Ideally, you already want to be FM level at tic-tac-toe by the time you're 3.5. But yeah, if you're already 4, I mean, you can still teach. You can always coach. Start teaching some students. But yeah, I'm afraid it's too late. Do I have any recommendations against the French that tend to lead to sharp positions? Yes, I do. If you search our YouTube channel, which we do not have a command for. No, there it is. If you search our YouTube channel, youtube.com/ChessDojo, check out Jesse's system to make French players squirm. I think that's what it's called. Jesse has an easy system, which I do not recommend, and he has a system to make French players squirm. I recommend the one that makes them squirm. It's this gambit. Um, E5 in the advance. Like here, C3, knight f3, bishop d3, and then the old way would be to just take back. Black goes bishop d7 and then takes the pawn. But the Jesse way is to castle and allow black to take another pawn on c3. It's kind of very similar like Smith-Morra in the Sicilian. You get your knight out, you get quick development, and yeah, very nice compensation for the pawn. So if you want something sharp, I think this is the thing to do. Yeah. But yeah, make sure to watch the video. And then he did another video because Magnus played it, and then he analyzed Magnus's game, which was cool. Yeah. Hector Gambit. Oh, that makes sense. Like Johnny Hector. Strong Swedish GM, big attacking player. What would I recommend against the four pawns attack in the King's Indian? I think just going c5, e6. You know, I'm not sure your level, so I don't want to go too deep, but it's important you challenge the center. You play e6 and you try to play against White's e pawn. Do I have any quick thoughts on the Latvian gambit? Remind me, I always confuse the Latvian and the elephant. One of them's e4, e5, knight f3, d5. The other one's e4, e5, knight f3, f5, which is even worse. 14, 1500. Yeah, I wouldn't overthink it. Basically, you're gonna castle. You go c5. They're gonna push d5. You're gonna go e6, and open the center. Try to put your rook on e8. Maybe bishop g4, knight d7. Maybe play for a6, b5. I guess that's not something I can really explain in like 2 seconds, but I'm sure there are some YouTube videos out there on playing against the four pawns attack. I know there's videos on like chess.com and stuff, but there's probably some on YouTube as well. Is the Benko or modern Benoni better for beginners? So again, I actually answered this question a little earlier. It's not like they're better or worse openings, just like you have your kind of personal preference and position that you kind of want to play. Like most players, generally speaking, either want to be like more attacking, like playing for the initiative, or kind of more solid. And so it's important to kind of choose openings that I think kind of align with what you want to do, but at the same time, without going, without it becoming a crutch, right? You don't want to just play only solid positions, only strategic positions, right? And never playing open positions either. But yes, when it comes to the Benko versus modern Benoni, personally, I like the Benko. I think it's a good gambit to play. I think it's pretty fun and straightforward. Benoni doesn't really appeal to me, but there's lots of players that do like it, so it could be good for you. That's kind of the thing. I think it's important to try different stuff. Honestly, my favorite approach was always just like choosing a player that I liked and then kind of building my openings around them. So yeah, I was always a fan of Kramnik's games and Aronian's when I was kind of learning to play d4. And studying the King's Indian, I looked at a lot of games by, the classics like, Bronstein, Geller, Gligrich, but then like more modern players like, Hikaru, Rajabov. Of course, lots of Kasparov games, Smirin. Yeah, I mean, yeah, tons and tons of King's Indian players to look at. Any recommendations for black against e4, c5, f4. Yeah, go d5 there. d5. When white plays f4, just play d5 and fight for the light squares. d5. This one I can put on the board because it's literally just one move. This is a one move recommendation. f4, d5. I mean, it makes sense, right? White played e4, f4, so we should go c5, d5. It's very logical. How could black be worse? You know? No, if anything, black is better. I really do like this position, no joke. Should I worry about moves that are marked good on post-game chess.com analysis? Sorry if this is a dumb question. No, that's a great question. I don't think you should pay attention to those things at all, really. I think they often just give like a wrong impression. And yeah, I never use them. I don't really use them with my students. I think if you want to analyze your games, the right thing to do is to go to specific moments where like you weren't sure what to do and you're like, yeah, I was thinking about this move, I was thinking about this move, and then analyzing those and seeing like, did you play correctly? Was there a much stronger idea you might have missed? And then you can maybe use the engine to help you at that point. But yeah, when they like run your game theory analysis and like, oh, engine thought this move is 0.3 worse than this move, or engine thought, it's like a lot of it is just not going to be useful. And so I don't think it's really worth sifting through it. It's much more useful, I think, to analyze the game with like a strong player, or like, for example, you could post the game in Discord. We have a very active and bustling Discord server. I think it was named one of Time's top 100 most influential Discord servers of 2021. So that was pretty cool. That's total lie. Sorry. You can post the game in the channel, one of the channels. We have like a games channel, and lots of players will give you feedback on the game that I think would be more valuable. Or chess. No. This is just a good move. Good move. Because if they go e5, then we get the bishop out and we get a nice French. I would even play h5 here. Bring the knight out this way. You can even play e6. It's still a very good French, where the knight gets this like dream square. And if takes, you can take. There's also I think this move. It's just kind of funny. Just gambiting. Or I think knight f6 first actually, and then if c4 you can play like e6 and like even this, I think. And yeah, we're a pawn down, but we get some very nice squares in the center of the board and some nice files. So this can be pretty fun. Yeah, Pumpkin, we already answered all the questions, so we're just wrapping up here. Yeah. Well, I think that will do it, guys. David was supposed to come on at some point, but I'm not sure what he's up to. He doesn't seem to be online. So yeah, that'll do it. But of course, the VOD is available. I mean, you can even watch the VOD during the stream, which is kind of funny. Oh, question from Stayman. Find that I do well from or through the early mid game, but slowly lose any advantage. Any tips or advice for late mid game transition to end game? In terms of the transition to the end game, I would say what's helpful is being able to evaluate different end game positions, right? So you might be up a pawn and you're trying to figure out which pieces you want to trade. Material might be equal, but there might be some kind of imbalance, pair of bishops, or rook and bishop against rook and knight. There could be different imbalances on the board, like in terms of king activity is a big one. If one side's king is more active, that could be a decisive advantage in many endgames that would otherwise be drawn. So being able to evaluate an endgame, I think, is very helpful because then it kind of tells you like what you need to strive for, and or whether you want to avoid the endgame altogether, whether you want to keep the queens on the board because you're going to be worse, and you don't want to trade. And to help with that kind of evaluation, I think the classic book is Endgame Strategy by Shereshevsky. I think that's one that can be read at almost any level, more or less. It's very very kind of heavy in prose and not like deep lines, but just showing ideas. And that kind of teaches how to play a lot of these typical endgames. And so by seeing those examples, that'll give you a kind of framework. So you're like, oh yeah, I kind of saw this type of endgame once, bishop versus knight. The bishop was better because there was play on both sides of the board. Oh yeah, I saw this endgame here, like two rooks against two rooks, but white was winning because their rooks were on the seventh rank and much more active. Like, oh yeah, I saw this kind of opposite color bishop endgame, but white had rook and bishop totally dominating, and so they were winning. So yeah, lots of these examples, and then that kind of helps you with the transition because you know what you're getting into. Does it ever make sense for white to play knight c3 in the Catalan? Yeah, it makes sense if white is trying to put pressure on d5 or play for an e4 break. It's not often or not common. A lot of times the knight is kind of nicely placed on d2 because it's defending the c4 pawn. But yeah, knight c3 shows up in many lines. Do I have a separate personal Patreon or just a group one? No, it's just a group one. Actually, it used to be my personal one, but then I converted it to ChessDojo, and now yeah, we just share it. So but yeah, I mean, that's still the best way to support the channel. How important would you say physical stamina is for classical OTB? It's very important. I mean, how important would you say physical stamina is for any competitive endeavor? Yeah, pretty important. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I think there's not even a lot of nuance. It's like when I get tired, my brain doesn't want to think as much, and I play worse. So if you have more energy, then you can keep your level for longer. I think we've all had experiences playing OTB where either the opponent outlasted us or we outlasted the opponent and ended up winning because of that. Ended up making fewer mistakes. Who is the best move-by-move book for a low-rated player as the target reader? I mean, I always thought the Chernev books are good, but I haven't seen a lot of the newer move-by-move books from Everyman Chess, so I couldn't say. But I always liked Irving Chernev. I also like this John Nunn book, Understanding Chess Move-by-Move. And that, coincidentally, is the only Nunn book I've read, Understanding Chess Move-by-Move. Moscow Variation, yeah, bishop d7, knight d7, I think. I would say knight d7 is probably, if you're a Najdorf player, maybe knight d7 is more fun. Hellstein's great. We all love Hellstein's books. Mastering Chess Strategy, Mastering Endgame Strategy is also very, very good. Oh yeah, Michiko, I have seen the workbook from Peter Giannatos. I liked what I saw. I think I'm working on some new recommendations for our new site, chessdojo.shop. And I think I will definitely be including his book in there because, yeah, I looked at like the preview and the sample, and I really liked what I saw. So it seems like a good book. But again, guys, we have a very active Discord where people love to debate and discuss things all the time, and they like to kind of repeat and rehash some of the stuff that we preach occasionally as well. So definitely join the Discord and start hanging out. It's definitely it's a great place to be.